It was only 124 questions.
So I don't know. I interviewed some of you, I'm sure, but I commonly say when I'm interviewing that it's like this year's like drinking out of a fire hydrant. It really is. This is a good example. I mean, here you are back in class. I guess you were just getting to grab some lunch at 11.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to start an EKG interpretation class today, and we'll go through the month of April, and we'll be finished. This is unlike anything else you're going to experience in this first year. It is a flipped classroom. And so the first thing I want you to do is close your computers, put them away, because we're not going to use them, and we're not going to use them for the whole class. If you want to use them at home to try to research some stuff, power to you. But this course is designed so that I'll present everything you need to know to interpret a 12-lead EKG in the next hour and a half or 2 hours. Everything you need to know. And then you'll go home and interpret 10 or 12 EKGs, and we'll use our class periods, not for lecture, but for you to tell me how you interpreted those EKGs. And we'll give you feedback on what you did. Okay? Yeah.
What was that number again? How many EKGs?
How many EKGs?
Yeah.
10 to 12 after every. So 10 to 12 on Monday, 10 to 12 on Tuesday or Wednesday,
Oh, I
10 to 12 on Friday.
I thought you said 212.
I probably don't speak very clearly, but that's good evidence that your brains are fried from this exam. So you don't have to think very hard for this information. All you have to do is open this book. This is like a 4th grade workbook. Okay? The material's a little bit harder than this. Now it turns out, there's a book out there. I don't know if any of you own it. The name of the book, I think, is Basic EKG Interpretations. It's a little yellow book. Oh my God, there it is! Dale Dubin. How many own this? Holy shit, where did you? Who told you to buy this? Huh?
My brother.
Your brother.
Jenna.
Jenna. Well, let me tell you about this book. I also bought this book when I was a first or second year medical student. I went completely through it. And when I got through with it, I had no clue how to read an EKG. And I taught EKG reading to senior medical students for about 15 years, using the method in front of you. Most of them had used this before they took the course, and they couldn't read EKGs when they started either. So I don't know why that is. Sorry you wasted your money. Dale Dubin, that in fact is the highest selling medical textbook in the world. It's sold all over the world in multiple languages. Dale Dubin went to prison for child sexual abuse.
Don't buy it.
I don't know what that has to do with anything, but it's a true story. Now, the book, Dale Dubin's book, as many books about EKG reading are programmed texts. So what programmed texts, the way they're organized is they give you a topic, and this would also be the way we would organize it if we taught this in lecture form. They'd give you a topic, anterior myocardial infarction. and they would draw pictures, sort of cartoons. I don't think there are any real EKGs in Dewey's book. Let me see that book again. Oh, you burned it already? Yeah, there are not any real EKGs in there. There's a lot of pictures and there's a lot of discussion. But when you're through with the book, you can't read an EKG. It's a dangerous thing. Okay, if you'll do what I tell you to do, you'll be able to read 90% of all EKGs sitting in front of you when you're through with the course. Maybe 95%.
Okay.
It's true.
Let's do this.
It's hard though. The work is going to be hard because what we're going to do is I'm going to go over everything you need to know to read a basic EKG today in about an hour and a half. And then tonight and tomorrow night you'll read 10 EKGs that are in the book. First 10. You won't skip that. And it'll take you an hour to an hour and a half to get that done. Because it's not super easy. It's kind of hard. You know, and these are real EKGs. What I did was I went down to the heart station at Presbyterian Hospital and I sifted through real EKGs and pulled out 80 that I thought would demonstrate everything you need to know about a variety of things. And I've been using it for 30 years, mostly teaching medical students. Any questions about how things are organized? All right, so we're going to start right there at the beginning of this book, and we're going to talk about heart rate. Oh, let me say another thing. So I think after I'm through at 3 o'clock, you're going to have a PA who is a cardiology specialist. He has worked in cardiology all his career, I think. He's going to come in and he's going to talk to you about EKGs. He's going to tell you more about the theoretical basis about how the EKG is hooked up and what's going where and what and so forth. It's part of that stuff I told you yesterday. It's part of the stuff that I forgot. I knew it at one time, but it doesn't help me in practice. I want to know what that EKG means, and so I only pay attention now to the EKGs. But someone will come in and talk to you more carefully about how this comes about in a more theoretical. When you're in practice, you'll have an EKG machine. You or someone else will hook it up to the patient and get you this EKG. And the EKG has a computer in it. And the EKG machine will tell you what the rate is. It'll tell you what the axis is. It'll tell you what the rhythm is. It'll interpret everything I'm going to teach you to interpret today. So you could say to yourself, I think I'll just rely on the machine. Problem is, you won't be able to pass the exam at the end of this course. You won't be able to get the EKGs right on the PANCE exam. And you won't be able to figure out, if you did that, you won't be able to figure out when the nurse or your buddy or somebody hooked the machine up. They could hook it up wrong. And if you pay attention to this course, you'll know it when you see it, that someone hooked it up. But I think the issue is, we believe you need to be able to interpret 12 EKG, so here we go. The rate on an EKG is determined right here. You just look at your EKG and you find a QRS, one of those big squiggles. If you can find one on a big line, there are big lines and little lines, right? If you can find a squiggle on a big line, you just start counting to the right, to the next big line. 300, 150, 100, 75, 60. You just memorize those numbers. 300, 150, 75, 60. So you find a squiggle on a big line and you start counting over 300, 150, oh, there it is, there's the next squiggle. So the next squiggle was between 75 and 150, and then you've got to interpolate somehow. You got to figure out, how do I interpolate between 75, or 100 and 150? There are 5 lines between 100 and 150, so you can do the arithmetic pretty well in your head. You can figure this out. So what I want you to do is calculate, using this method, calculate the rate, the heart rate, on every EKG. It doesn't have to be exact. Don't spend an hour and a half worrying about it. It needs to be close. And if you figure out a way to interpolate between 150 and 300, 100 and 150, 75 and 100, you'll be able to get this. This will speed up for you. Okay? And we're not going to argue about whether the heart rate's 78 or 82, because they're both normal. And it doesn't mean anything. All right? So if the heart rate's greater than 100, just below that, if the heart rate's greater than 100, we call it tachycardia. Your job is to write tachycardia in that little line there. This is like 4th grade. If the heart rate is less than 60, we call it bradycardia. Brady means slow. Tachy means fast. Tachycardia, bradycardia. And they're defined by greater than 100 and less than 60. Easy enough. Rhythm. So every EKG has a rhythm. There are a whole variety of rhythms. Sinus rhythm, atrial fibrillation, sinus tachycardia, atrial flutter, the 2-to-1 block, 2nd degree heart block, 3rd degree heart block, 4th degree heart block. Okay. This is not a course on arrhythmias. You'll learn a little bit about arrhythmias in this course, but not much. Arrhythmias is a whole different domain of cognitive function, in my opinion. And if you want to become a cardiology PA, then you'll need to learn a lot about arrhythmias, and you buy another book about it, or you take a course, or delve in some of the way. It's not the same thing as basic 12-lead EKG interpretation. But we're going to learn a little bit about it, and we're going to try to figure out what the rhythm is on each of these EKGs. Okay, so the next page has some helpful hints on how to figure out what the rhythm is. Okay. Do a little bit of definition here. These are the 3 primary squiggles on an EKG. This first one is the P wave. This one is the QRS. And this one is the R wave. T wave. Okay? The P wave is a squiggle on the baseline of the EKG that tells us that the atria contracted. The QRS is a squiggle that says the ventricles contracted. And the T wave is a squiggle that says that the ventricles are repolarizing. There's a depolarization curve, there's a repolarization curve, and the T wave is the repolarization curve. So the first hint on trying to figure out what the rhythm is look for P waves. The second question is the ventricular response to the P waves regular or irregular? So what's happening in the heart is the atria contract, the electricity goes through the AV node and stimulates the ventricles to contract. When the ventricular contraction is over here at the end of the QRS, there's a repolarization time. If the P waves are always causing the QRS. If there's always a P wave before every QRS in a fairly regular fashion, this is called a sinus rhythm. Sinus is the term, it's a term that comes from the fact that the normal heart fires up in the atrium at the sinus node. There's a node, there's a group of cells that fire off electricity. It's called the sinus node. And then what happens is it goes, here's the sinus node, and the electricity goes down and hits an AV node, atrioventricular node, which slows it down. And then it goes into a left bundle branch and a right bundle branch, which we're going to talk about later. And those bundle branches fire off the ventricles, and they do so almost simultaneously. So the normal heart has a sinus beat, which is P wave. Then it takes some time to get through the AV node, that's this distance. And then the ventricles contract, and then the ventricles are silent for a while, and that's called repolarization. That's the T wave. Okay? You'll probably have 3 or 4 people lecture on this part of cardiology, because it's pretty basic and important stuff. So the hints are, locate P waves before every QRS, and the QRS are the big ones. Try to determine if the ventricular response to the P waves are regular or irregular. If they're regular, it's a sinus or normal sinus rhythm. If the P waves exist, describe the ventricular activity and look for repetitive patterns. Those are sort of some hints on how to kind of think about arrhythmias. But as I said before, arrhythmias is a much more difficult domain than what we're talking about. So what I did was I gave you 4 examples of relatively common, easy to recognize arrhythmias. Okay? Now look at the first one. Remember that what you're trying to do for the rate is locate a Q. Let me talk about QRS. This is really confusing. This is very confusing. QRS is the ventricular depolarization curve on the EKG. Does that make sense to everybody? This next little bit is really important. QRS is like a word, but it's also the definition of some actual things. But when clinicians talk about the QRS, it's like they're talking about a car. Because the ventricular depolarization curve can look a variety of ways. I mean, a car as opposed to a Ford, or as opposed to a Chevrolet car, QRS. That's the ventricular depolarization curve. And in reality, that's a Q, that's an R, and that's an S. There's always a baseline, okay? And if the first thing that happens in the ventricular depolarization curve is down, it's a Q, by definition. A while ago, I showed you this, and I called it a QRS, and lo and behold, there's no Q, because it's a car, it's not a Ford. It's a car, it's a QRS. I don't know why we did that, but that's the way it is. The QRS is the ventricular depolarization curve. There's not always a Q. That's a Q. The next thing that goes above the baseline is an R wave. The first thing that goes above the baseline is an R wave. So that's an R wave. If the R wave results in going below the baseline, it's an S wave. It could be that all you saw was this. That's a QRS. because it's a QRS because it's a ventricular depolarization curve. It's a car. It's not a Ford, it's not a Pontiac. There's only an R wave there, but we call it QRS. That's why I said yesterday, clinical medicine is difficult because the words, the vocabulary is ambiguous. And this is a great example of the ambiguous vocabulary of clinical medicine. Is everyone clear about what I'm saying here? First thing above the baseline that's positive is an R. It goes down, that's an S, and now that's an R prime. It goes back up, that's an RS R prime. It's QRS. But there's no Q wave. It's tiny on the last wave. Is everyone clear on this terminology?
I have a question.
Do what? Yes.
So is an S anything that goes down or anything that goes down below the baseline?
Well, I misspoke. I said everything that went down below the baseline, but actually anything that goes down after an R wave.
Okay, there's an S,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Great question. Listen, I like it. Caught me in my own lie. I lie all the time. As my wife says, I'm commonly wrong, but never in doubt. Okay. Where are we? All right, so you look at a QRS and find it on the big baseline and then count 300, 150, 100 and tell me what's the rate of this first rhythm strip. What's the rhythm? What's the rate? About 150. It's really close. It's really close to 150. Look for P waves. Do you see P waves? Kinda. Yeah. So sometimes it's hard. It's not like Vanetta drew it on the board. There's a little squiggle, and there's a little squiggle before each QRS, isn't there? Mm-hmm. Well, here's the hint, and you can jot this out at the side. Here's the hint. It's really uncommon to have a sinus rhythm, a sinus tachycardia greater than 150. About the only time you do that is when you're exercising really, really hard, right? You're running on a treadmill, or you're running a mile run, or you're if you're in good shape, you know, you don't get your heart rate above 150 very often, right? So on an EKG, people with EKGs aren't exercising, they're laying on a table. Someone's hooked them up to electric. If their rate's going at 150, actually the real issue is if it's going between 140 and 160, which is going to be hard for you and I to tell by just looking at the EKG. If it's going 150, it's more likely atrial flutter with a 2-to-1 block. This is atrial flutter with a 2-to-1 block almost every time when the ventricular rate is 150. So here's really what this is looking like. This is sort of what that looks like, right? Except I've drawn the QRS is a little too wide. But in reality, if you look at this carefully, there are 2 P waves for every QRS. You see that P wave down there in the bottom? Well, you would never recognize it, but it's there. There's a squiggle right after the QRS down there on the bottom. So there are 2 P waves for every QRS. What's happened is that atrial flutter is a rhythm where the atria are beating too fast. The atria are beating 280 to 320 beats per minute. And they're not fluttering, they're beating. They're beating too fast. And every other beat gets passed through the AV node. So if you can see multiple P waves on the baseline, you may be looking at atrial flutter. where flutter is a rhythm where the atria are fluttering by beating too fast, or the ventricles are fluttering and beating too fast. Okay. Fibrillation is where they're not contracting. Fibrillation is where they're just doing this. The atria are just fibrillating. Okay, so look at the second one. What's the rate of this second one?
70, 80.
All the way down.
It's what?
Like 80?
It's 80 on some of them. It's highly variable. It's about 80 on some of them, and it's about 55 on some of the others, right? So it's highly variable. Look at the P waves. Are there P waves? Are there P waves? Well, there are small waves between all the QRSs. Now the question is, are there P waves causing the ventricular contractions? In other words, are the P waves married to the QRSs? If they are, there's a variable. There's a variable distance between the P and the Q every time. Wow. I have a special tool that I use that is probably the most useful tool for me. I think it's called an EKG caliper. And I use it for a variety of reasons. I use it to tell the intervals, and I use it to figure out what the rate is, and I figure out something like this. I put it down in front of one of those P waves and in front of one of the QRSs, and then I move it along here to see if that PR interval stays the same. And in fact, it's different every time. The ventricular response to the P waves is never regular. This ventricular response is irregular. It's completely jumbled up. It's nearly random. Okay, so listen to that term. It's an important term in cardiology. The rhythm is irregularly irregular. So I can diagnose atrial fibrillation. This is atrial fibrillation. Those really are not P waves. Those are probably artifacts or something going on the baseline, but they're not contraction of the atria. This is atrial fibrillation, and I know that because the ventricular response is irregularly irregular, and there are no P waves that are consistently causing the QRSs, like the one above. I mean, the one above, the P waves are causing the QRSs. There's just an extra P wave in there every time. So I can diagnose atrial fibrillation most of the time. I can be fooled, but most of the time I can do it by just putting my fingers on the patient's radial pulse. I have a buddy who goes into atrial fib spontaneously, periodically, and we ride bikes together. And he said, "Oh shit, I think I just went into it." And he stopped, and I put my finger, and I can tell if his ventricular response, which is the pulse, right? If his ventricular response is irregularly irregular, there's no rhythm to the irregularity, then he's in atrial fib. So this is atrial fibrillation. The third one, so the rate on the third one is variable, right? It goes from nearly 150 to about 75. It's all over the map. Yeah.
Can we go back to how to figure out heart rate? Because I don't think I understand. So,
Okay.
so you don't
Look
go.
at the previous page.
Yes.
you find a QRS,
Uh-huh.
you look to the right, the next large line is 300. So if your next QRS was on that big line, your rate would be 300.
Okay, so do we start like at the end of the QRS? I guess I'm getting confused on.
Use the point, use the point,
To the top.
use the point.
Whether it's top or bottom.
Doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Use that point or that point.
I get it on
Is
here, but
everyone,
not
is
on
everyone
here.
good on rate?
No.
This third
I get it on
rhythm
here.
strip
Yeah, I totally get on here. I don't get it.
has a variable rate from 75 to 150. Well, that's kind of interesting. In some places, it's really close to 150. And in some places, it's really close to 75. Now, that's not by error. 75 is a multiple of 150, isn't it? 2. So you look at the baseline. What do we see on the baseline? The textbooks. If you look at Dubin's book, what he will show you with this is that it looks like this. But of course, no EKG ever looks like it. Okay? He calls it the sawtooth pattern. And these are all P waves. So what you've got is a flutter situation, but instead of it always being a 2-to-1 block, it's sometimes a 3-to-1 block, sometimes a 4-to-1 block. So that's what this third one is. It's atrial flutter with all these P waves on the baseline with a variable block. Sometimes it's 2-to-1, sometimes it's 3-to-1, sometimes it's 4-to-1. Atrial flutter with a variable block is what that is. Yeah.
On that one, where's the baseline?
You gotta make it up.
Oh, you just
gotta
draw a
make it
line,
up.
okay,
Yeah. It's a virtual line.
okay.
Yeah.
Can you go into a little bit more detail on what you mean by block? Variable?
Yeah.
Just
yeah.
the amount of P waves?
Yeah.
Why does that mean block?
There's a block. There's a block between this P wave and the QRS. For some reason, that P wave didn't cause a QRS. This one did. This one was blocked. This one was blocked. This one was blocked. This one went through.
Okay.
So it's a block.
Makes sense.
And sometimes it's atrial flutter with a 2-to-1 block. 2-to-1 means there are 2 P waves. So there's 1 P wave and then 1 goes through. One's blocked, 1 goes through. Good question. So there aren't any dumb questions, right? There's just people who don't understand what I said because I was not good enough at saying it well. I can't say all these things clearly for 36 different individuals.
For the rate, do we start over at 300 after every QRS? So like when you're counting on the big lines, you can count it from this QRS, then when
Yeah.
you get to here, is this then 300?
Yeah, so you can just, she's looking at rhythm strip number 2. You can just glance at it and tell that this rate's
Yeah.
different than this rate, right?
But just as far as, I guess I got confused on because this
That's-
is here down to 60, but there was a QRS, so I was like, should we start over?
Yeah, well, all you start over every time.
Okay.
And so,
Between 2 QRSs.
I'm sorry?
You're always just measuring the rate between 2 QRS.
And then start over.
Out to
Sorry.
so just between these two, but what we
Okay, now look at the fourth rhythm strip. This is the other one that's super important. This one is super important clinically. Does everyone have an extra, like, sheet of paper they can use? No, I don't need it. You need it. Okay. Find a sheet of paper.
I'm gonna run out of this notebook.
What strikes you by glancing at the fourth rhythm strip?
The regular rhythm.
What's wide? Well, there's one wide QR. The third one is real wide, the others aren't very wide. Well, they're a little bit wide. Yeah, they're a little wide, huh? They're a little wide, you're right. They're all a little wide, one of them is real wide. What else did you notice about this? The atria and the ventricles don't seem to be communicating. There are P waves, but they don't seem to be talking to the QRSs. The third thing that ought to jump out at you.
Inverted T wave.
Well, they are kind of. What else jumps out at you? It's slower than molasses. It's really slow. How slow is it? It's so slow I didn't even give you a number for this. It's bradycardia. It's really, 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 really slow. Probably about 30. Okay? All right, so take your piece of paper and lay it on the baseline and put a mark where you think there's a P wave. And mark about 3 or 4 of them. Lay it down and put a mark on your paper where you think there's a P wave. Where you're pretty sure there's a P wave. And mark 3 or 4 of them.
I only see 3 or 4.
You got it? You got a mark? Now take your piece of paper and move it to the right and line them up again. Do your marks always fall on the P waves? Yeah, they should be really close. You see how they fall? You're moving your paper over and your marks line up with the P waves to the right. If they don't, you mark something on the P wave along the way. So this is third-degree heart block. This is third-degree heart block, and we're going to talk about first-degree heart block, and we're going to talk about third-degree heart block, and we're going to not talk about second-degree heart block. Second-degree heart block can be a course in its own right. We're going to ignore it. But we're going to talk about first-degree and third-degree heart block. Third-degree heart block is super important because the ventricular response to third-degree heart block is so slow that the patient might die. If the patient's in third-degree heart block, you kind of need to take a breath. Don't send them home out of the ER until the cardiologist has cleared them, because they might need a pacemaker. It might be intermittent, it might be not an emergency, but you need to pay attention. And this is the cheap person's way to figure out if this is third-degree heart block, by just marking the P waves and moving across and see if they keep matching up. You'll hear a phrase. Cardiologist will say, yes, that's third-degree heart block. The P waves are marching through the QRSs. It took me about a year to figure out what the hell they were talking about. The P waves are marching through the QRSs. The P waves are coming at some rate. There's some atrial rate. And the ventricles are beating nearly at random. They're escaping. The ventricles are beating at their own rate. P waves, the atria, are beating at their rate, and they're not talking to one another. But the atria are beating regularly. And so they march through the QRSs. Make sense? So that's just 4 examples of rhythms. What we'll do is we'll try on every EKG for these 80 to name the rhythm, okay? Now, The next thing that the EKG will read out is the axis. Okay? Now, maybe this next lecture will, maybe we can talk a little more about that. The axis is super confusing because what we're doing with QRS, I mean with an EKG, a 12-lead EKG is a two-dimensional picture of what's going on electrically in a three-dimensional structure. So if we were able to be inside the heart and look around at where the electrons were flowing, some would be going above our head, some below our head, some this way and that way. It's a three-dimensional reality, and we're trying to figure out what's going on with a planar view. Okay? Axis is a way of understanding pathology in the heart it's a two-dimensional picture of a three-dimensional phenomenon. All right? And it's kind of confusing. So what I've done is I've drawn figure 2 is called a hexaxial reference system, and it's been designed by, I don't know who designed it years ago. So there are these leads. And your lecture next hour will show you where these leads are in terms of putting them on your arms and your legs and so forth. There's lead 1, there's lead 2, there's lead 3, there's lead AVR, AVL, AVF, there's lead V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. There are all these leads. Okay? This hexaxial system only uses 1, 2, 3, and AVF. This is 0. This is plus or minus 180. This is minus 60, minus 90, minus 120, plus 60, plus 90, plus 120. These angles and degrees and lead names are totally arbitrary. What I mean by arbitrary is that somebody years ago just made them up to try to describe as best we can using a two-dimensional picture what's going on in a three-dimensional heart. So I wouldn't spend 1 millisecond worrying about where they came from. I wouldn't. If the pants exam were to ask you some question about that, I'd say to hell with them. Give it to them. You know, it's not worth it. I don't think they will either, because they know it's not worth it either. All right, so all we have to pay attention to do the axis is these 4 leads. Okay? And so this is a 60-degree angle, this is a 30-degree angle, 30, 60, 60, 30, 30, 60. Okay? We're going to make use, our brains will begin to make use of that symmetry. Okay? The more leads you put up there and draw out and so forth, the closer you'll get to the real axis. But we only have to get approximately. As a clinician, we only have to get approximately. Okay? Now, some of you will probably design your own method of doing this. I'm going to show you my method. I don't know how the hell I just turn to EKG 7. I don't know how I figured how I designed this, but I developed it myself. When I was a medicine resident, the way I was taught to do EKG is I took a couple classes in medical school with EKG. So they threw me in a heart station and said, read these EKGs, and the cardiology fellow will overread them and tell you what you got wrong. So during that month or two, I developed this system. It's kind of weird, but it works really well. And here's what I found. For most of you, if you'll actually perform this thing on every one of these EKGs, your brain will develop a pathway that allows you to glance at an EKG and tell me whether it's right axis deviation, left axis deviation, or normal axis. And that's all you need to know. You don't have to know any degrees. What you have to know is this left axis, right axis, or normal? That's all the EKG is going to, that's all the machine's going to tell you. And I would be willing to bet that the machine's got an algorithm built into it that does exactly this somehow. Okay, are you on EKG number 7? Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out what leads are what. And you're going to mark these on every EKG, okay? So this is lead 1 with a capital I. Lead 2, lead 3. One, two, three. Over here, this is AVR, AVL, AVF. AVR, AVL, AVF. You got those written down? Can't see. You can see that they're different. Look at lead 1 on your paper.
AVR, AVL.
Oh, you do? Okay,
What's
so
the last
look
one?
to the right of lead 1. See how the
AVF.
QRS is completely different? That's a different lead, right? That's AVR. Just below that is AVL. And just below that is AVF. Everybody got that? 1, 2, 3, AVR, AVL, AVF? No?
I think that one has to be.
How are you determining those? ABR, ABL?
That's lead 1. You see how these QRs are completely different? It's got to be a different lead. That's AVR. These are different than this, that's AVL. These are different than these, that's AVF. It's only about 3 or 4 beats per lead. Is everyone clear on? Is everyone clear on this? You can have that.
3 or 4 beats.
1, 2, 3, AVR, AVL,
That makes
AVF.
sense now.
Clear?
They all look different.
Is anyone who doesn't have these? There are only about 3 beats per lead, right?
No idea.
What happens is you hook the patient up with a lead on each of the hands and each of the legs, and then you put an electrode across the chest, and then you just turn on the machine, and it just reads this out, because it's got a computer in it and knows what it's doing, okay? And it'll come out marked. The reason I make you mark them is that your brain has got to learn what's what. And it can't do it by waiting for the computer to tell you. You'll never learn anything. So you mark 1, 2, 3, AVR, AVL, AVF on every one of those. Okay? Those are the limb leads. Those are the leads determined by the electrodes on the legs and the arms and the hands. Now, there are 6 leads placed on the chest. V1, V for V leads, ventricular leads, I guess. V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. And they are V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Got it?
So your back was like.
Okay, but look here. These are different than these. These are different than these. That group is V1, V2, V3. This group is V4, V5, V6. You got the V leads?
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6.
Yeah, the bottom one's hard. I'm literally just throwing it out.
My eyes are like.
Yeah, my right here. Yeah, because he's lying. The one that caught you. I just
Yeah, so like this is one, then it's changed. Well, this is V1, then this is V1, this is V, yeah, this is V.
I just want to
So the students just said, look at lead 3.5. They look the same. I said, well, on 3, it goes down first. The QRS goes down first before it goes up. And on lead AVF, it never goes down. That's the kind of detail we have to pay attention to be able to get these things read.
So I thought 3 and 8.
Yeah, look for when the QRS is a little different. It's a different lead.
These are the same.
This one's the same. These 3 are the same. It's just not quite as dark or as high, but it goes up a little below the line. And they're very dissimilar. Right? So that's lead 3, V4, V5,
So like
He's like, well, it could be the same, but
I think this is where, so I'm being 3 and this is ABF.
So what is the demarcation line? You said here's 3.
So these are all the same.
these are different.
Precordial leads or V leads. There are a whole group of names. The V leads, V1, V2, V3, V4, V5, V6 are called precordial leads. This is the precordium, right? Precordial leads, V leads, chest leads, as opposed to limb leads. Everybody have them labeled? Because this is really important. Okay, now I'm going to show you my goofy little way of figuring out what the axis is. We're going to use lead 1, 2, and 3 and AVF. Okay? And we're going to make up an arbitrary rule because it works. It's not arbitrary. It works with this. It works with this hexagonal system. Okay. When the QR, we're only going to, for the axis, we're only worried about the QRS. We're not worried about the P's and T's. We're just worried about the QRS. We want to know, we sort of want to know in this heart, here's the right ventricle sitting up anteriorly, here's the left ventricle sitting down here. The right ventricle is a little tiny wimpy piece of muscle, and the left ventricle is a big old thick, big time muscle, right? So if the electricity goes through there, there's probably more of it going down here than here. The strength of the voltage going through that left ventricle is probably greater than the strength of the voltage going to the right. But we're going to try to draw it in 2 dimensions. We're going to use these limb leads. When the QRS is above the line, we're going to think of it as positive. Okay, this is really tricky. When the QRS is above the line on the EKG, we're going to call it positive. And when it's negative, when it's below the line, we're going to call it negative. Here's the problem. This is where your brain has to turn this thing around. Look here. The pluses are down here below the line. The negatives are up here above the line. So we've drawn this hexagonal system just exactly backwards the way we look at the EKG. Which is why you have to draw this thing 80 times for your brain to be able to glance at an EKG and know what the axis is. Okay, so we're going to look at EKG 7. We're going to figure out what the axis is. We're going to do it quickly. We're going to count small boxes. Look at the QRS in lead 1. How many small boxes is the QRS?
2.
Small boxes, not big boxes. There are 5 small boxes in each one of those big boxes. 9. Everyone good on 9?
How the hell did you get 9?
What's a box?
Yeah, what's a box?
Is a 4-sided square.
Where is the box?
You see the boxes?
I got like maybe 2.
The paper is made up of big boxes with tiny boxes inside. Oh.
Wait, are we
Oh.
There's like 4 this way instead of this way.
Well, there are 2 problems. Because I've been using this book for 30 years, the horizontal ones are gone. On a real EKG, there are boxes inside those boxes.
That's not a problem. That would be.
Did you ever figure out the V1, V2, V3 thing?
Between each of these.
Okay, we'll just count the big boxes. There's 5
Okay, well, V1, V2, V3, is a difference in the what waves?
Okay, does everyone see what the problem is on this EKG? Those horizontal stripes between those, inside those boxes aren't there. But on an EKG, there'll be 5 of those. So you're going to have to interpolate this. Someone said 9. So look at lead 1.
When should I get
You
9?
see how there would be 5 between the first 2 and 5 in the next ones. And it's almost to the second one, so it's 9.
So we're looking at the peak, we wanna
know how high is it.
Okay.
We don't care about its width, we just want to know how high it is.
Did you even jot?
Okay,
I'm sorry?
Did you try to jot on the board?
so each of these boxes more
Yeah.
complicated. Correct.
So this would be, are you looking at it right? Because it could be 1 and 2, but we're missing the lines that go with it.
Yeah, like each little box has 5.
But there's actually not that.
So then you have 5,
It's gonna be almost 10.
so
That's where they're getting.
you'll get 5 pairs of 4.
This is what it would look like on a real EKG, because each one of these boxes has 5 lines horizontally and 5 lines vertically within it. And your QRS on this one, it goes like this. Goes 9. So your brain's going to have to worry about that. And you don't have to get very close. You don't have to get very close. If it's above one line, it's more than 5. If it's below the next one, it's less than 10. Come on, Okay? So, one is positive 9. Right? Now, this is lead 1 on this thing. And I'm just going to arbitrarily draw an arrow here. And I'm going to label it 9. It's arbitrary, totally arbitrary. Look at lead 2. The first two are different than the third one, so let's just worry about, well, they're not too much different. Let's just worry about, how high are those in lead 2? 11? 11? And they're above the line, so here's lead 2. They're a little longer than 9, so I'm going to put the arrow a little longer than that one and label it 11. See how I made it just a little longer? I'm just I'm estimating all this stuff. I'm not measuring them out. I just have to be close. Lead 3.
4.
Why do you say 3?
I say 4.
Huh?
I say 4.
It's 4 above and 1 below. This is like a number line. It's 4 above, that's 4 positive. It's 1 below, that's 1 negative. So it's plus 3. Got it?
About 9.
So here's lead 3. I'm going to make it about a third of this one. Making those arrows there. Everyone with me so far? Questions?
Can you explain, sorry, how you got 3 one more time?
It's 4 above and 1 below.
So you're looking at,
4 minus 1.
oh, both of these.
It's like a number line.
What are the arrows?
So do you always look at
Okay, okay, so,
do you always look
okay,
at both of
everybody
these?
listen. This is important. The question is, what do the arrows mean?
And then 1 or 2. So like this is all
What we've got is a circle with lines in it, right? And we know where they're going. This line is plus or minus 180 degrees. This one is plus 60 or minus 120 degrees. So they have a direction. And when we draw it at a certain distance and label it 9, they've got not only a direction, but they've got a quantity. What do we call that? A line with a direction and a quantity?
Vector?
A vector. Those are vectors. It's going to become important here in just a minute. How about ABF?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the QRS is 9 boxes. Why would you not minus the one piece off?
So where's this ABF?
It's not
These are all the same. I'll show you.
All I'm interested in is the quantity of the height of the
Look
QRS.
at leads.
Take a look at all
So
QRS.
some of the QRSs are only above the line, and some of the QRSs go up and down.
Where the
You have to
lines
count
are
the whole
demarcated.
QRS. What's going up and what's going down.
Like there's no,
So like this one goes
so like
down.
here's these like
There's no set line. You have to figure it out.
What is ABF? We gotta move on.
so like in the
Everyone agree with 5?
Sure, why not?
I think it's 6. This is
ABF.
pretty easy. This one has to be about twice as long as that one. Now, I'm going to go to everyone knows what we have here. We have 4 vectors. By definition, you can add 2 vectors together by what? By making a parallelogram out of the 2 vectors and bisecting. Right? Remember that? You gotta go back. All those who don't remember have to go back and take a math course. You can add 2 vectors together by making a parallelogram out of them and bisecting the parallelogram. Okay, so here's a 9 and here's an 11. I'm going to make a parallelogram out of it. Does everyone see my parallelogram?
Yeah.
Anyone who does not see the parallelogram? Now I'm going to bisect it. I've added 1 and 2 to get this one. Now I have 3 and F and this one. I went from 4 vectors to 3. Now I just add them up in any fashion I want to, because 1 plus 2 plus 3 is equal to 3 plus 2 plus 1. I can add them any way I want until I get 1 vector. So this is easy to do. Here's a parallelogram. Now I just have 2 left. You don't have to be exact. You gotta be close. You've got to be able to know whether this is a normal axis, a left axis deviation, or a right axis. And we'll define those in a minute. What is this axis? What's this? Huh? What degrees? Plus 66? I'm not arguing with that. I don't know. Huh? Maybe it's 70? I don't know what it is. But it's somewhere between plus 60 and plus 90. Here's plus 60 right there. Right?
Oh, that's our final vector.
That's the final one. I call this a plus 70 axis. I must tell you, I made this up. I don't think you'll find this in any textbook anywhere. But it works so well that if I read 3 or 4 EKGs, if I've been away from it for months, and I read 3 or 4 EKGs, I can glance at an EKG and tell you what the axis is within 10 or 15 degrees.
So it seems like the placement of the arrows is very important. Is there ever like a measured, like we said 9 is like more towards the right, but like that is coming into play, very important.
It's always to the right if it's above the line.
Yeah, I know, but like the amount that 9 is to the
Okay,
right.
so all those vectors I originally drew, the 9, the 3, the 6, and the 11 or whatever it was, are all just in relationship to one another. They're not measured out. I could have taken a ruler and made a 9 and then a 3 and then a 6, but I just guessed at it. This one, if you measured it, is about 1/3 of this one.
But it wouldn't be wrong to like actually use centimeters or something like that
To use what?
like a ruler and measure.
No, it wouldn't be wrong. It would just take you so much time, it wouldn't be worth it.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Because I did the same thing, and you said 70, and I got like dead on 60, and I don't know if that's.
they're both right. We're not going to get in a fist fight over whether this is 60 or 70, right? If you're within 15 degrees of each other, you're right.
15. Okay. No
Now, the computer in that machine, is going to do this 10 times better than you and I, because they've got an algorithm and they've got measuring sticks. And so they plug it into their algorithm and it's exact. So it might be 60.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be 75. Okay? Yeah.
Sorry. So I just don't understand where to get this puzzle from.
So I've been doing.
I got this.
No, Paul just,
Is this one? Right?
Paul just drew his lines differently. So if you draw your lines differently, you're going to get a different axis, but it should be still close. I can tell you for you.
The question was, do you always start in the center of the circle? And the answer is yes.
There's what we call X,
Everybody okay with that?
And this is
plus Y.
so I need to draw lines
Let's go
down
back
to
to
make
the
it.
front of the book.
And then,
So you take your components,
and
any
then
vector,
parallel
and
to.
equals to
And then what's this other one? I'm sorry. Or perpendicular, not a perpendicular.
So if I have like
In the upper right-hand corner of the next page, it's the same page actually. The
Parallel
next
to
page
this one.
is the definition of normal axis, left axis deviation, and right axis deviation.
So it's parallel to that one. And then
When you bisect it.
Okay, so
Yeah, just a bit.
someone just said what? So that means the heart is
And then you just
tilted? Okay, so let's not worry about what it means. Because there are 1,000 reasons why you might have left axis deviation. There are 1,000 reasons why you might have right axis deviation. And most EKGs you're going to see are going to be normal axis. And they're defined on this right here. Left axis deviation, LAD, is defined as minus 30 to minus 90. Normal is minus 30 to plus 90.
Where do you see this?
Right axis deviation is in this right lower quadrant. RAD, right axis deviation. And then the upper left is indeterminate. If your final arrow winds up in that left upper, I call it axis indeterminate. Now, why do I do that? There are a lot of authors who do that. I didn't dream that up. A lot of authors call that left upper quadrant indeterminate axis. Some authors call everything over here right axis deviation. It's ambiguous. I mean, we're trying to describe something in 2 dimensions that in reality is a 3-dimensional thing. So everything we're doing regarding axis on an EKG is an estimate, which is why we can draw these arrows willy-nilly, kind of. It's all an estimate anyway. There is a thing called a vector cardiogram, but no one ever uses it anymore, and it puts a bunch more leads on, puts them around the back. Boy, it's real complicated stuff. It's so complicated and so unuseful that no one uses it anymore. Okay? It's one of the few things medicine decided to give up. All right. Intervals. There are 3 intervals we have to worry about. The PR interval is from the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the ventricular depolarization curve. From the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS. Right? And each of these small boxes is 0.04 seconds. And each of these large boxes is 0.20 seconds. Intervals are seconds. So we judge where the P wave begins, and we judge where the QRS begins, and we measure how many small boxes, and we multiply by 0.04. And we're doing all of these intervals in the limb leads, not in the V leads, these first 6 limb leads. Everyone clear on the 0.04 and the 0.20? Okay, so it says normal. The PR interval, the normal PR interval is greater than, so the PR is greater than 0.12 and less than 0.20. So the PR interval needs to be at least 3 boxes wide, and it needs to be less than 5 boxes wide. I wrote it down. The PR interval has to be greater than 0.12 seconds and less than 0.20 seconds. I would write that down there under normal. If the PR is less than 0.12 seconds, you have a diagnosis. It's called pre-excitation syndrome. Write that down on that line there. Pre-excitation. If the PR is less than 0.12 seconds, you have a pre-excitation syndrome.
There we go.
Never mind. There's one person in the world who's a worse speller than me, but I'm not yet mad at him. So I'm afraid there's a dash in it, there's pre-dash excitation. But I don't know.
Post excitation. You want to take the time to explain to me the
If the PR is greater than 0.20 seconds,
V2, V3?
the diagnosis is first degree heart block.
Something heart block? What heart block?
First degree.
First degree.
I'm sorry?
That's the same thing as AV block.
It's first degree AV block. Yeah, first degree AV block, all right? First degree heart block. The second interval is the QRS interval, so it's the beginning of the ventricular depolarization curve to the end of it, whether it's a Q or an R or whatever it is, S, from the beginning to the end, and the normal QRS is less than 0.12 seconds. Equal to or less than. Equal to or less than 0.12 seconds. On the next page, go to the bottom of the page, the PR, or the QT interval. The QT interval is the beginning of the QRS to the end of the T wave. I want you to measure that on each of these EKGs and write it down. But the normal of the QT interval is not exact like it is with the PR and the QRS. It's variable. So just write down the normal is variable and it depends on the heart rate. So the faster the heart rate, the shorter the QT interval is. The slower the heart rate, the longer the QT interval is. We're going to measure it on every one, and we're not going to worry about trying to make a diagnosis out of it. We will make a diagnosis out of the PR interval and the QRS interval. There'll always be a diagnosis, but not the QT interval. Okay? Now, I'm going to move a little quicker here. If the QRS is greater than 0.12, if the QRS is greater than 0.12, we have a bundle branch block. Okay? So I'm going to draw you some cartoons about bundle branches. This is the cartoon, and this is the septum, this is the left ventricle, and this is the right ventricle. We're going to think of those: right ventricular muscle, septal muscle, left ventricular muscle. Okay? And since this is the right ventricular muscle, we've got a V1, a V2, a V3, a V4, a V5, and a V6. Those are the precordial leads. Okay. Now, what this first cartoon is going to be the normal. I expect you to draw this cartoon, and it is going to. The normal has a sinus node up there, comes down and hits a AV node. And then the right bundle goes down this side of the septum, and the left goes down this side of the septum. So those long lines I've drawn out of the AV node are the right bundle and the left bundle. This can be considered an electronic circuit. You've got a node up there that's the SA node, it's in the atria, and it fires off. And it goes down a wire to the AV node, which slows it down a little bit. and then it goes into two wires, right and left ventricle. It turns out that this left ventricular bundle is heavier, physically heavier, and faster than the right. So in the normal human, when that electricity hits the bundles, the first thing that happens is the septum is activated from left to right. That vector right there is the electricity activating the septum from the left side to the right side. And then these ventricles are activated simultaneously. So in the normal heart, the electricity starts in the atrium, hits the AV node, slows down a little bit, then hits the bundles. The septum's activated before the ventricles, and then all the ventricles are activated at the same time, which is why they contract at the same time in the normal heart. Make sense? Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so this is the right bundle branch block. SA node, here comes the electricity, here's the AV node, left bundle, right bundle, and we're going to block the right bundle. I'm going to draw lines across it. It says it's blocked. We don't know why it's blocked. Maybe it's fibrosis, maybe there's something, there's something wrong with that. Something's interrupted that electric circuit, so it doesn't activate. So let's figure out what happens first is the left bundle activates the septum as usual. Now, all we're going to worry about is V1 and V6. We're not going to worry about V2, V3, V4, V5. When you're worried about, back up. When you see that the QRS is greater than 0.12 seconds, you know there's a bundle branch block. By definition, if the QRS is greater than 0.12 seconds, there's a bundle branch block. Right? So we got to figure out what it is. We look at V1 and we look at V6, and there's a pattern. The first thing that happens is the septum is activated from left to right, but the right bundle is blocked, so V1 can't see anything. What happens the second is the left ventricle gets activated. So the normal V6 would see the septum being activated with a tiny little downward, because it's going away from it. And then it would see the electricity coming back toward it. And then it would see the electricity going away from it. In a right bundle branch block, the right ventricle has to be activated by the electricity traveling to the myocardial muscle. The electrical pathways are blocked, so it has to go through the myocardial muscle. What does V1 see? When a V lead sees electricity coming toward it, it makes a positive deflection on the page. When it sees electricity going away from it, it causes a negative deflection. So V1 would see the ventricular activation. It would see the septal activation. The left ventricle would go away from it. And then late in the QRS, here comes the electricity again. This is one of the most recognizable things in electrocardiography. The rabbit ears in V1. The rabbit ears in V1. It's an R, S, R prime. And that is the right bundle branch block. Almost every time. Almost every time. To test yourself to make sure that's the right bundle, you can look at V6. And you can ask yourself, what's going on? What does V6 see late in QRS? if it's a right bundle, V6 ought to be seeing the electricity going the other way. So the QRS ought to be negative late in the QRS and V6, if it's a right bundle. If those two things match up, it's a right bundle 99.999% of the time. Questions about that? Left bundle branch block. First thing that happens is the septum is activated backwards because the left bundle was blocked. So now the septum has to be activated off of the right bundle. And V1 happens to, and the left bundle has to go through the myocardium. Now you can see why the QRS is wide. The QRS is wide because these ventricles are being electrically stimulated in series instead of in parallel. In parallel, in the normal heart, they're being activated simultaneously, and so the QRS is narrow. When there's a bundle branch block, they're being activated in series, so it's wide. Greater than 0.12. So we just draw it. V1 sees a little going away, some coming back, and then a lot going away. V6. V6 is interesting here. It sees the septum coming toward it. It sees the ventricular activation going away from it. And it sees the left ventricular activation coming toward it. So you've got an RS, R prime, but the right ventricle is such a measly little muscle that it doesn't have time to get below the baseline. So it usually looks like this. The area under the curve in V6 in a left bundle is above the line. The area under the curve late in the QRS in a right bundle is above the line. QRS is too wide. So you see a deep S wave in V1, you see this wide, everything above the line in V6 in the left bundle. Those patterns are so recognizable when the QRS is too wide that you'll begin to recognize them by glancing at the EKG. You don't have to worry about this if the QRS is greater than 0.12. If it's normal, you just go on about your business, right? Any questions about bundle branch blocks? And PR interval greater than 0.20 is just a first degree AV block, so you have to worry about that. Now here's the discouraging thing. This seems backward to me. I'm getting ready to say it seems backward to me, but I've never been able to figure out how to turn it around. Everything I've told you from started from my talk. The computer and the EKG machine can do better than we can because it's got algorithms and it measures things exactly. And it's nothing more than arithmetic and geometry, right? That's all it is. It's all arithmetic and geometry, and it can do that better than our brains. Everything I'm going to finish with between now and 3 o'clock, we do better than the computer. And everything I'm going to tell you between now and 3 o'clock is the most important stuff about the EKG. Not the stuff I've been talking about. But you got to know it, you got to be able to figure it out, so you got to plug through it. Okay. Next page. STT wave changes. I've drawn some cartoons. The normal set of events is this. An upright P wave, a QRS, and a T wave that's upward. Now I want to walk through several things. First of all, let me tell you, the reason we do this better than the computer is that the only thing we're looking for now is really, is this a pretty picture or an ugly picture? Before, it's all numbers and geometry. Those are very different things. Is it a pretty picture or an ugly picture? The computer doesn't do that real well. It does it pretty well, not as well as we can do it when we're good. So here's the thought experiment. We take a rabbit to the cardiac lab, and we open its chest, and we put electrodes V1 through V6 on its chest, on its heart. And then we ligate, we put a ligature around a coronary artery. It's a normal young rabbit. We put a ligature around the coronary artery. And here's what the rabbit's heart looks like normally. And then we reduce the amount of blood to a portion of the heart by tying off one of the coronary arteries. We don't tie it off, we just narrow it. So that the demand for blood is greater than the supply of blood, right? That's called ischemia. When the demand for blood is greater than the supply of blood, it's ischemia, and what we call ischemia on an EKG is an inverted T wave. This is an area that if you go on the internet and you start Googling ischemia and injury and all that stuff, you're going to get way more than you bargained for. So I would recommend not doing it. I would just use what I'm telling you to try to read these EKGs. They'll spend plenty of time doing that. Now, if we leave that ligature on long enough, or if we inject a little epinephrine in this rabbit, cause the heart rate to go up, the demand will go up, but the supply can't go up because we've got the coronary artery constricted. So the myocardial muscle that's being supplied by that coronary artery is going to start getting in trouble. Ischemia, by definition, is reversible. If I just cut off that ligature, the T wave jumps back up to normal, no damage, heart's normal, everything's okay. But if I leave it on long enough, or I increase the demand, I develop an injury pattern. So, where's the T wave? That T wave's pretty obvious. That T wave's pretty obvious. Where in the hell is the T wave? You know, it's here. This is the ST segment. It's the ST segment from the end of the S wave to the beginning of the T wave. ST segment. Here's the test. What you'll read most often is that this is an abnormal EKG because the ST segment is elevated. Don't write that down. Don't write that down. It's misleading as the dickens. Let me show you why. Where does that T wave begin? I can't do it very well here. Here's where This is where the S wave ends. I don't know where that T wave begins, but there is a segment. And let's say we decide T wave begins there. That segment that is elevated. But that's not the test. So when you see that term, ST segment elevation, ignore it. Apply the following test. You are an observer from up here, looking down on the ST segment. And if it's concave, it's bad news. That's an injury pattern. If you're up here looking down and it's convex, it's a normal pattern. That's the test. That's much more reliable than this elevation thing. Because if you use elevation, you can't figure out what the segment is or what's going on. So look for convexity and concavity. If it's if it's convex, call it bad news, call it injury. Now, by definition, if we were to quit giving that epinephrine, or we were, yeah.
First you said concave was bad, and then you said convexity. Which is better?
I drew it right.
Okay.
Concave, convex is bad.
Okay.
Concave is good. Smiley face, frowny face.
I'm more confused.
Concave. Okay, so the whole key is you're the observer looking down on the ST segment. If it's convex from that perspective, it's bad news. If it's concave from that perspective, it's normal.
Oh, so it goes down.
We actually define concave and convex. Concave is like a cave. Convex is the opposite. Any other questions about this? Now listen, if we were to cut loose that ligature right now on this rabbit, that would probably, most of the time, that would come down to normal. So injury pattern means, we think, injury pattern on an EKG generally means the muscle is so ischemic that it's beginning to lose its cellular integrity. You might be losing troponin, leaking out into the blood. You might be losing CK enzymes. Enzymes might be losing out in enzymes. But if you cut the ligature, or if you zip a catheter in there and dilate the artery, you might get away with saving the myocardium. If, on the other hand, we just leave it there and we leave this epinephrine infused so that the supply is fixed, but the demand keeps going up, we'll develop a heart attack. On an EKG, this is real important because it's going to become super confusing in the next week. A heart attack, a myocardial infarction on a 12-lead EKG is defined by a Q wave. If there's a Q wave anywhere on the EKG except AVR, oh, let me tell you, you can ignore AVR for the rest of your life. Don't even look at it. Don't even think of it. Just ignore it. It doesn't mean anything. It's backwards. It's confusing. It sucks. I don't know why they even have it. Ignore it. If there's a Q wave and it's greater than 0.12 wide at the mouth, and it's greater than 0.12 deep, it's an infarct. And remember, over here on on the bundle branch blocks, I was drawing some Q waves because the first thing V6 saw in a left bundle branch block was the activity going away from it in the septum. I drew a little Q wave. That was a Q wave because the first thing that happened was that it went down, but it's always so tiny that it's not significant. A heart attack Q wave has to be 3 little boxes wide at the mouth and or 3 little boxes deep to be an infarct. Q wave. What's a Q wave? If the first thing that happens in the ventricular depolarization curve is down, it's a Q wave. So you're going to have to scan when you're looking for ischemia, ischemic heart disease, heart attacks. You're going to be looking for inverted T waves. You're going to be looking for convex ST segments, and you're going to be looking for Q waves. Let me back up. Is there any question about this ischemic heart disease? It's kind of easier than all that other stuff we were talking about, but it's easier, but we're better at it than the computer because it's a matter of is the picture pretty. It's really hard to write. It's really hard to write an algorithm for whether that ST segment is concave or convex. Probably not impossible, but let's back up. Let's stop for just a moment and say to ourselves, why would we order this test? Well, we mostly order this test to see if someone's symptoms are ischemic heart disease. 99% of the time, it's because someone comes in the ER or your office and says, I have chest pain. And you get an EKG to see if they have inverted T waves or convex ST segments or Q waves. The point being this. You never order an EKG, a 12-lead EKG. You never order that if the question is, well, it's never the question, I wonder if they have the right bundle. It's never a question. It's not a clinical question. It doesn't matter. You might find one on the EKG, but if they have ischemic heart disease, that's an important question. If your question is, I wonder if they have an arrhythmia, you might get a 12-lead EKG, but what you really want is a rhythm strip. What you really want is lead 2 that goes on for a couple of minutes just to see what's going on. You don't need 12 leads, you need a rhythm strip. So this is a test that is almost exclusively used to rule in ischemic heart disease. We used to get EKGs on 30-year-olds who came in for their aneurysm. I need to get an EKG. How come? No one ever said how come, because they think we're gods. The question would be, how real? So they didn't ask why, they just laid down, we hooked them up, charged them $60, $80, $150. Mostly because I have a car payment. Sad answer to the truth. Turns out that we don't do that anymore. So when a 30-year-old comes in for an annual exam, we don't do an EKG unless they have symptoms, because all it does is pay our Mercedes fee. It's all it does. It doesn't help. It doesn't help. Okay, so why do we order it? We order it because we wonder, do they have ischemic heart disease? Any question about inverted T waves, convex ST segments, or Q waves? All right. So the next page says when we find ischemic changes, either ischemia, injury, or infarct, we have to say where it is. Okay? 1, AVL, B4, 5, and 6 are lateral wall. And what we're talking about there is the lateral wall of the left ventricle. Right? The right ventricle is sitting up here, and the left ventricle is sitting laterally and posteriorly. So when we see ischemic changes in the EKG, in 1 AVL, 4, 5, and 6, it's lateral wall. It's easy to remember because L, it stands for lateral, and 4, 5, and 6 is over here on the lateral chest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If they're in 2, 3, and AVF, it's inferior wall. Inferior wall is down here at the bottom of the heart, down here at the apex. Inferior wall, 2, 3, and AVF. Luckily, F and inferior would have an F in them. V1 and V2 are septum. V3 and V4 are anterior. V1, well, yeah. V2 and 3 are anterior. You will see some people calling V1 and 2 septal and V3, V2 and V3 anterior. Don't worry too much about it. The anterior and the septum are usually involved together. But I think your testing will show that V1 and 2 are septum and V2 and 3 are anterior most of the time. So if we say let's say we see T waves in 1 AVL, V1, V2, and V3. 1 AVL, V1, 2, and 3. I would call that anterolateral ischemia. Right? Anterolateral, inferolateral. You can mix and match these things, but this is localization. Okay? Any questions about localization? The localization only counts for ischemic changes. T wave inversions, convexity, Q waves. Now, we have an infarction. If we have a Q wave and it's significant, 3 boxes wide, 3 boxes deep, or 3 boxes deep, it's going to be dated. So we can think of this ischemia, injury, infarct pattern. If it looks like this, Q wave, ST segments on the baseline, and the T wave's inverted, we call it age indeterminate. That's the second one. The first one is acute. That's an acute MI. There's a Q wave and there's an injury pattern, convex, ST segment. This is an acute MI. This is age indeterminate. And if you have a Q wave with a normal upright T wave, it's old. What happens there is you had an infarct, that piece of muscle that whatever lead is looking at has a Q wave. It's dead muscle, but its repolarization has returned to normal. So the muscle around it is repolarizing. Okay. Acute, age indeterminate, and old.
How long does it take to go from age indeterminate to old?
I don't know. Weeks to months, not days. Yeah.
So just looking at 3, I would have thought it was sinus, a regular rhythm. So what exactly?
You talking about EKG 3 or?
With the Q wave, ST segment is baseline, and the T wave is up, right? So like, what about that makes it? I mean, one of those.
There's a Q wave. Q waves define infarcts. If there's a Q wave, it's 0.12 wide and or 0.12 deep, it's an infarct. Other questions about that? Yeah. Oh. Other questions? Okay, there's only one more thing. So we've taught you how to tell what the rate is, and the rhythm, and the axis. And then you got to go back and study the whole EKG after you've done rhythm, rate, axis. You got to go back and study the STT waves to see if there's any ischemic heart disease or Q waves or other any influence, right? Now, there's one other thing that we can diagnose on electrocardiogram most of the time called left ventricular hypertrophy. So the ventricle is a muscle not unlike the bicep, right? And if you get up every morning and grab 2 30-pound barbells and do this with them 20 times, 4 times in a row, those biceps are going to get bigger, right? They get bigger through the physiologic process called hypertrophy. They hypertrophy. If the ventricle has to work too hard, let's say the left ventricle is trying to push blood out a hole, the aortic valve that's supposed to be 3.5 cubic millimeters in the surface area, 3.5 cubic centimeters. If in fact it's 1.5 cubic centimeters, then the muscle has to work harder. Precisely what my ventricle is doing right now. It's pushing blood through a 1.6 cubic millimeter hole that was supposed to be 3.5 cubic millimeters. So my left ventricle is hypertrophy. It's thicker. It's bigger and thicker than it's supposed to be. And if you laid me down and did a 12 lead EKG, I always say laid me down because I don't want to stand up while you do an EKG. I don't know why. I just like relaxing. So if you were to do that, you would find ESCA scoring criteria for left ventricular hypertrophy. Okay? And they are the following. R or S in the limb leads of 20 millimeters or more. That gives you 3 points. Or S in V1, 2, or 3 of 25 or more. R wave in V4, 5, 25 or more. Here's what I would do. Here's what I would do. You don't want to go through and measure all these things to see if they have this. You want to glance at the EKG. Look at the lateral chest leads. What does it say here? S in V1, 2, or 3, those are the anterior leads, are R waves in V4, 5, and 6. If the S waves in the anterior leads, V1, 2, and 3, look too deep, or the R waves over here in 4, 5, and 6 look too tall, start looking for LVH. That's the most likely cause for either one of the findings. I'm going to go ahead and show you. I don't think I drew pictures of this, or maybe I did. No. So it says any ST shift without digitalis. Digitalis is a heart drug, and it causes the same ST segment changes. So to use this criteria, they can't be on this is an ST segment shift. It's an asymmetrical drop down into an inverted T wave. That's called strain pattern. It might be hard to distinguish that from ischemic T waves, but that slurred ST segment down into an inverted T wave is sort of textbook. If you saw that and you say, well, that doesn't look really like ischemia, it looks more like strain, then look over at V4 and 5 and 6 and see if those R waves are too big. Then you can start counting out points. That's 3 points. Okay, here we go. Left axis deviation of 15 degrees or more, minus 15 degrees or more. I said you don't even start calling it until 30. Right? Minus 30 is where you start calling left axis deviation. So I disagree with Estes. But if you had a minus 30, you could get 2 points for it. QRS interval of 0.09 or greater, you get 1 point for that, anywhere on the EKG. And intrinsicoid deflection in V5 or V6 or 0.04 or more, you get 1 point for that. Beginning of the QRS to the peak of the R wave is called intrinsicoid deflection. If that's greater than 0.04 in V1, you get a point. So the LVH business, I wouldn't spend a huge amount of time on LVH. Right? You'll begin to recognize what normal R waves in V4, 5, and 6 begin to look like, and when you see one that's really too tall, really out of order, you'll say, what the hell that is? It's probably LVH. Or deep S waves in V1, 2, and 3. That's probably LVH. Then you could go back to these criteria and kind of worry about them and look for it. Okay? Again, these are pretty much equations and measurements and numbers, and the EKG machine will do a better job of that than we can. So, what we're going to do is we're going to have you interpret the first 10 EKGs at home. There is a worksheet for each EKG. So it says, what's the rhythm, what's the heart rate, what's the PR, QRS, QT intervals, what's the axis? Thermal axis, I didn't use that term, but that's what's the axis. Pattern of tracing is, where do you see, pattern of tracing is, where do you see signs of ischemia? Inverted T waves, convex ST segments, Q waves, that's pattern of tracing. Pattern. Is the picture ugly or pretty? Once you've filled that part of this thing out, the diagnoses just fall out because of the way we've defined them. And you may have one conclusion, maybe a normal EKG. There are some normal ones in here. Or it might be just a first degree AV block. Or it might be a first degree AV block, left ventricular hypertrophy, anterior infarct. Maybe multiple diagnoses. Okay. So fill that out and try to figure out what the diagnoses are on the first 10. On Friday, we'll meet here at 8 o'clock. I think it's an 8 o'clock class on most Wednesdays and Fridays for the rest of the month. And I've got your names all written down. So I'm going to randomly call your names. I don't really know who you are. I'm going to learn for you all. I'm going to randomly call your names. So you can't cheat this system. If you don't have an answer, you'll be really embarrassed. If your mother died and you didn't get to them, let me know before class. Don't let your mother die twice in April. And I'll just skip around here, and you'll have an opportunity to probably answer a couple of these in the month. So it'll take at least an hour to interpret 10 of these the first time. It'll get quicker. After about 4 sessions, it'll get a lot quicker. Questions? I'm good, yeah.
What if we just have difficulty reading like the EKG because the quality is like not all there?
Well, then you can just
try our
do the best you can.
Okay.
there are some things about them that aren't great quality, but I think they're good enough quality to read, to get the diagnoses on them. Now, I will tell you that there will be an exam at the end of this month, and I think we'll have you interpret 10. Is it 10? We'll have you interpret 10 EKGs. They won't be any of these. They come out of a book, a textbook, and the quality of those will be pristine. Those will be, there won't be any problem with quality of reading them.
On a normal EKG, those grids are red and the actual tracing is black, so it's not the same color. It's much easier to see, and you can obviously see every line.
Yeah.
So
Uneasy.
that's the way your test will be also.
Questions? Okay, we're done.
Can you show me these parallel lines?